Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Sao Dialogue on Sustainability, Architectural Culturalism, the Indonesian Story, which is organized by CCRD-CS Lingnan University in Hong Kong, Global University for Sustainability, and Spirit 45, Indonesia. First, let me introduce myself as a host of Global University for Sustainability. My name is Sitchoy Jadi Margaret. Currently, I'm Associate Professor at Southwest University in Chongqing, China, and I'm also a Global U founding member. Global U is an international network of 200 founding members with a substantial number of scholar activists from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. It was officially launched at the Tunis World Social Forum in 2015. Now the executive team has been based in Hong Kong, China. Global U has organized 5 major projects, such as Sao Forum, Sao Dialogue, Global U Book Series, which are collaborate with Palgrave Macmillan and the Oriental Press in Beijing. We are also produce videos to promote alternative perspective and practices of the scholar activists, not only on YouTube channel, but also on popular media platforms in mainland China, like Bilibili and Toutiao. We have organized 6 series of the Sao Dialogue since 2020, including Venezuela struggles, experience of indigenous community in Chiapas, Mexico, African people struggles for liberation, alternative paradigms in Brazil, the resistance of Rojava in northeastern Syria, and traditional medicine in the Global South. We have already started series number 7, Architectural Culturalism, the Indonesian Story. Tonight, we will have the 6th section of the theme 2, Colonial Experiments, number 3. Let me introduce the moderator for this section. Mohammed Nanda Riyada works at the Department of Architecture, Faculty of Engineering, University of Indonesia. He received his bachelor, master, and doctoral degrees respectively from Oklahoma University, the Architecture Association London, and University of New South Wales. His focus is on architectural histories, particularly in the post-1945 period, with research conducted in Jakarta, Bandung, Bogor, and Copenhagen. In 2016, he served as a curator in the field of architecture for Indonesian Creative Economy Agency. He authored and mostly co-authored several books on architectural histories in post-independence Indonesia. One of the co-authored books, Dagang Bedang, 100 Tahun, Perspective Architecture di Indonesia, which is a book on architectural development in Indonesia between 1900 to 2000, and which received an award by the Indonesian Institute of Architects, Jakarta chapter in 2012. I will now turn over the floor to the moderator. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Margaret. I hope everybody can hear me well. I'm Nanda, as Margaret already said. I've been trusted to act as the moderator for this evening. So good evening, everybody. May I introduce to you the 2 speakers today? First is Adianto, Johannes Adianto to be precise, is a faculty member at the Architecture Department at Universitas Sriwijaya in Palembang. He's been involved in various researches, as well as authoring several books, I believe, not to mention journal articles, of course. He's been active in researching on what happened during the colonial era, particularly in Sumatra, but not limited to what happened in Sumatra. Whereas the other speaker is Inyoman Gede Mahaputra, who is a faculty member at the Architecture Department at Warmadewa University in Denpasar, Bali, Indonesia. I forgot to mention that Yohanes Adianto received his doctorate at Institut Teknologi 10 November in Surabaya, whereas Gede Mahaputra received his doctorate from Oxford Brookes University. Gede Mahaputra has been active in researching on Bali since the colonial era to post-colonial era, and I believe this evening we will have a very, very exciting, interesting, intriguing thought, thought-provoking presentations by both Yohanes Adianto and Iyoman Gede Mahaputra. So first, I'll ask Mr. Adianto, who will present his presentation which is titled Beyond Adaptation, Contextualism, Colonial Memory, and Architectural Agency in the Dutch East Indies. And after that, Mr. Mahaputra will present his presentation titled Framing Paradise, Colonialism, Ethical Policy, and the Fabrication of Balinese Architectural Identity. So, Dr. Adianto, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nanda. I will share my presentation. Okay, I hope already seen in your monitor. Okay. This evening, I want to present my presentation with title Beyond Adaptation, Contextualism, Colonial Memory and Architectural Agency in the Dutch East Indies. We will examine how the constructed environment in Dutch Indies serve as a principal arena for the conflict between imperial imposition and local agency. In my last presentation, I talked about the railway system and how it connects to the sugar mill. I also discussed about how modern materials have changed over time in both buildings. Today, I keep continuing these stories, this time about architects and their works. We start with the work of O.B. Norbury's book. His record 100 of Dutch architects provide an important data in 3 points. However, this data indicates a substantial gap. It is still predominantly Java-centric and concentrate on the architect as a single hero rather than a player in the contested epistemological field. To decode this field, I utilize David Utama concept of epistemic imposition. Utama argued that the Dutch colonial state imposed Western technical standard to delegitimate indigenous building practices, effectively weaponizing architectural knowledge to consolidate colonial power. I compare Utama thesis to Samir Amin the linking. Samir Amin contend that the global South must disconnect from a Eurocentric imperative. Architecturally, delinking is not adaptation, but a structural reorientation of knowledge and authority away from the colonial center. The term beyond adaptation refer to architectural practices that are proactive in negotiating an identity rather than reactive to the sun or rain. It is about architectural agency, the designer ability to navigate inside against colonial structure. Mas Eka had discussed timeline in prioritization. I utilize it as the framework for our discussion. I believe we must beyond aesthetic classification. We can conduct additional in-depth analysis. My methodology adapts a post-colonial typomorphology. We examine how the spatial kind and urban or architectural form were modified not out of necessity, but with the deliberate intent of creating a place architectural language. Traditional history frequently examines colonial architecture through the lens of style or climate adaptation. My research contends that we must look beyond the aesthetic category to understand architecture as an ideology enterprise. Today, I will discuss these three Dutch architects. Architects include Henry Mecklenburg, Thomas Karsten, and Wolf Schumacher. These three, according my research, are already beyond the tropical adaptation of Dutch East Indies condition. But how did they fare architecturally? This is how I perform my analysis. Henry Mecklenburg was born Mr. Cornelis, now called Jatinegara, on June 21st, 1884, to Dutch and Bugis Spanish parents. He graduated in 1909 from Delft University. Mecklenburg designed a facade of hospital in Amsterdam, this building. He also designed and built a facility for blind children in Gerlach between 1909 and 1911. In his early work, Mecklenburg was influenced by Nieuwe Schoon style, a Dutch take on Art Nouveau. Paul returned to Java in 1911 and designed several railway company offices because his father-in-law, Mr. Gerlings, was board member of Semarang Cirebon Stumstram Maskapi, which hired Paul to design a new office in Tegal, this building. This was Paul's first work in Dutch East Indies. Paul drew from his Dutch design approach in Tegal, but with a focus on the humid tropical climate of Dutch East Indies. Paul already adapted to tropical climate in the first building. Paul found an architectural office in Semarang in 1913. Mecklenburg invited his Delft classmate Thomas Karsten to join his office since it was overflowing. Between 1913 and 1915, Paul already periodic visit to temple in Central Java and the Majapahit historic site in Trowulan, Mojokerto, East Java. This journey notes, including Mecklenburg illustration, was published in 1915. This was starting point for Paul research into the rich architecture of Dutch East Indies. The period between 1930 and 1915 also constituted the worst moment in Paul's architectural career. This book, with title Henry Mecklenburg Architect Between Two Worlds, discuss the change surrounding the construction and imply university building at ITB, Bandung Institute of Technology. In September 1980, architect Henry Mecklenburg was charged in developing the layout and building at ITB. Paul refused to merely import classical European architecture style to colony. Instead, he developed Indo-European architecture that combined native building tradition with modern construction technique to accommodate the tropical environment. Paul drew influence from design of old Javanese palace in Solo and Yogyakarta. Rather than establish a single dominant building, he divided the mass of the building and focused on open space between them. which connected by pillar and pergola. This book illustrates how the campus meshing is efficient and clear, with option for building pattern and open area. Pon explained to the ITB campus design committee that the building form should be recognized and welcoming to 18 years old students from rural places without forcing them to encounter modern technology from afar. However, this style, which resembles a hamlet and the natives' village, has sparkled significant controversy. McLaughlin contended that the Indies appear was a Dutch royal responsibility for university structure in Dutch East Indies to welcome native students without sacrificing utilitarian quality. Henry McLaughlin was given the liberty to experiment with the structure in order to produce unique building. The design also has to be adaptable for quick modification and growth, as well as a cost-effective. The structure was both cost-effective and simple to build. McLaughlin implemented a building grouping that allowed for extension while also taking into account the environment, which has an impact on inside comfort. Service and support facilities were separate from the main building and spread out over numerous areas to avoid obstructing light and air movement and to and from it. Henry McLaughlin nearly gave up hope in the Dutch East Indies and yearned to return. But his life journey immersed him in life of destitute there. This also applied to De Vogel, this person, Pon Cousin, and then head of health department. This talk is notable to Pon Cousin to bamboo, material that grows so directly tied with the life of community. Furthermore, Henry McLaughlin worry was exorably related to productivity and potency. Henry McLaughlin advocated structural improvement in use of bamboo in the people home over the use of new material, which would have an influence on the poor financial situation. This is the illustration. It upon concern for the architectural diversity of Dutch East Indies, as well as efficiency and effectiveness associated with modernity. In the new task, Pon dug more into the architectural tradition of Dutch East Indies, which led him to investigate roof. The humid tropical environment had architectural impact that differ significantly from those of the Netherlands. This led him to the conclusion that home in Dutch East Indies serve as a form of cover, similar to youth's umbrella. Henry McLaughlin was subsequently sent to excavation of the Troulan Temple, where he was responsible for excavation, documenting, and preserving the artifact. During the process, Pon confronted the issue storing the relic discovered in Troulan. 30,000 antique coins were among the smallest relic found. The key difficulty for Pon in Troulan was the design basic shelter for all the archaeological discovery to affordable, non-collapsible, and was around 10 times 10 meters. Pon early tests undertaking 1926 used wire bundle as its cable on 2 times 2 meters platform with a low-pitch ceiling. Pon also tried horizontal bamboo strip as the replacement to telephone line to support the wooden roof covering. The Pusarang church proved to be an ideal setting for this construction system study. Pusarang church is a unique pioneering work because the Pondopo basic structure is dynamic, inexpensive, and weather-resistant using simple material. Henry McLean Pon created the Pusarang Church in Kediri, which is masterwork. The strongest attempt to tectonic reorientation remained with the colonial institutional system. Pusarang morphology resembled the old Majapahit Candi. Pon effectively combined Catholic liturgy with a spatial design that felt old and unique to East Java. Henry McLean work showed that the contextualism is a type of resistance. He challenged the Eurocentric monopoly on the scientific construction by demonstrating the local techno could accommodate modern purpose. Pon wielded immense power. He decolonized the building very bone progressive from adaptation to deep structure immersion. Now we look at the second Dutch architect, Thomas Karsten. Thomas Karsten born in 1944 into a precious Dutch family. His father, a professor in faculty of literature and philosophy, and his mother was a German descent and born in Ngawi, East Java. In August 1914, Karsten sailed from Berlin to Dutch East Indies at Henry McLean Pon invitation and request to assist him in Semarang. However, in 1916, Karsten left the McLean Pon Bureau to start his own architectural practices. McLean Pon influence, however, continued to have an impact on Karsten, who frequent to Dieng area, particularly a temple. Karsten met Sumbina, the daughter of former Swiss soldier and Javanese mother during his travel to Dieng in 1918. Karsten married Sumbina on June 21st, 1921. Karsten's initial project include 2 buildings in Semarang and 1 in Medan. One, the structure in Semarang was insurance office building. This building. One of the and Delhi Spoorweg Maskapai office, which were both constructed in 1920. This building in Medan. The 2 Karsten pieces use similar approach to McLean Pon work in Tegal. Their design strength stem from their climate responsiveness and investigation of local material and appreciation of local worker capability, all while following the Dutch East Indies government public building norm at the time. This was Thomas Karsten's introduction to the condition of Dutch East Indies. Sompok village renovation began in 1918, and Karsten helped build in 1920 and 1923. Following that, Karsten's responsibility extended, as did the area planning for Melaten village. The village orientation also considered the sun course. Karsten designed open space that allow for air circulation and sunlight were influenced by the idea of Frick Tilema, the pharmacist and Semarang City Council member who took environment held seriously and expressed his thought in the six Kromo Belanda series published between 1915 and 1926. Tilema recommended providing clean water, adequate environment cleanliness, and illness control strategies. These suggestions were used for domestic design and material selection. Thomas Carson work reached in its pinnacle, demonstrating city of Dutch East Indies as a whole, with the design of Ijen district in Malang City in 1933. The design process has been ongoing since 1929, when the Malang city government approved Carson design. However, authorized design was changed in response to many requests from the Malang city government, and it was only completed in 1933. Carson made more adjustments and refines in 1935, when the scope, particularly the limit of area, changed. Carson responded not just to the tropical climate, but also socio-economic and culture trends, as well as political issues. Discuss socio-economic and culture issue in the Carson building, we can see how Carson designed and on traditional market. Pasar Gede began in Surakarta in 1929, followed by Pasar Jatingaleh and Pasar Landung Sari in 1930, all in Semarang, and culminate in Pasar Johar in 1938. Thomas Carson used the latest reinforced concrete technology, Mastum column, in Pasar Jatingaleh, Pasar Landung Sari, and Pasar Johar, but he adjusts it to the logic of tropical market. The technology supported the context, not the other way around. Return to Carson's architectural legacy before he became an urban designer, Carson's interest in architectural richness of the Dutch East Indies appear to have begun when he was in a romance with Prince Prangwodono, who subsequently became Mangkunagara VII in June 1917. This friendship with Mangkunagara continue until 1943. The conversation with Mangkunagara VII also impact Carson's design for the Sobokarti Theater in Semarang. Thomas Carson experimented with the layout evocative of European theater combined with the design reminiscent of traditional Javanese dwelling. The idea was allow Javanese people to express their social bond through folk art in more modern setting, while also feeling familiar given the building recognizable design. Thomas Carson embodied agency via social revolution. He criticized the transplantation of the European city to the tropic without considering the local inhabitant. Thomas Carson opposed the epistemic imposition of racial zoning. He advocated that the Indies city should be undivided, not separate into colonial enclave. Carson worked within the system and advised 200 municipalities. His agency was discovered in capacity to negotiation colonial fund to meet indigenous need, an excellent example of situation agency. Yet, this negotiation did not dismantle the colonial planning system, but rather reform it from within. At Sobokarti, Carson transformed the traditional open pavilion known as Pendopo into a modern amphitheater. He adapted Western theater geometry from Javanese social event, resulting in hybrid venue. Carson Agency was social spatial. He felt designing the correct type of architecture may influence a nation's social behavior toward freedom. Thomas Carson went beyond adaptation, using architecture as a tool for social engineering and racial integration. Now let's discuss the third Dutch architect, Wolf Schumacher. Schumacher received his higher education at Breda, the Netherlands, after being born in Banyu-Biru, Central Java in Dutch East Indies. After working at the Batavia Gemeente, he collaborated with the Moyen. After that, he went back to Batavia Gemeente as a leader, where he was in charge of creating public space, like the market and Batavia urban planning. Schumacher then moved to Bandung and opened the architectural firm with his younger brother, Richard Schumacher, who was also teaching at ITB in May 1918, after Wolf Schumacher returned from the United States. The Wolf Schumacher later replaced his younger brother at ITB from September 1st, 1924 until the end of December 1940. At the first, the company had the three assistants: Van Leeuwen as the mock marker, Van Ooyen and Job Ricard as the draftman. Three periods can be distinguished in Schumacher work. During the first phase, which spanned 1918 to 1920, Schumacher gave priority to practical contemporary aspects while maintaining a significant European influence. Symmetrical design became a defining feature of Schumacher building during this initial phase, especially those with office uses. The Renaissance style also seemed to have influenced Schumacher. Schumacher design was less suited to tropical temperature, but the horizon crossfield building, this building, demonstrate the use iconic column head. It is said Schumacher design for West Java Handel Maskapi building was influenced by Indian stupa, the spot. The Becker and Co. office show the influence of Otto Wagner, an early modern architecture figure in Art Nouveau style. A shift in design methodology may be seen in the Jarbier building. Schumacher play with the various volumetric composition and is influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright organic architecture, which once stated that architecture should be appropriate to time, place, and human users. This work also marked the first use of the Kala head ornament. During the second stage, Schumacher began use establishment influenced by temple. Schumacher passion in temple appears in his own collection, which keep at home. The practice of attaching ornament to the modern structure is known as eclectic architecture, and it flourished over the world at the start of the modern age. Ornament commonly used on the current structure in Europe derived from classical Greek or Roman architecture. Therefore, Schumacher concept was similar to those contemporary European architecture at the time. Wolf Schumacher peculiar style may be seen in the Van Drop office book, which feature the Kala Makara over the entrance, this part. Vertically and horizontal lines are particularly prevalent, aiming to reflect Bandung humid tropical climate. White projecting overhang shield the room and the window from the sun and rain. The white building constructing line and dark effect in passing its horizontal and vertical line. The Kala head design also found in the majestic case, this building. Schumacher, a sculptor, a painter who adored Hindu and Islamic culture, art, and architecture, was especially fascinated by decoration in Dutch East Indies. He even carried out special investigation in Egypt, India, and several another country. One of Schumacher's best period was his church. Schumacher building abandoned the local decoration to adapt to the tropical climate. Schumacher masterpiece is Villa Isola, this building. Everything is about building is Art Deco. Villa Isola Schumacher flat roof ignore tropical climate adaptability. Instead, that employing architecture, Schumacher highlight reinforced concrete technology capacity to withstand tropical climate. This building, symmetrical exterior and horizontal vertical line remain notable. The Grand Hotel Preanger, another Wolf Schumacher masterpiece, instead the standard villa and hotel. Schumacher used opulent Frank Lloyd Wright style decor. This technique should this new location ideal located on the Kipus Road. Schumacher used this uncommon opportunity to create a stunning, well-executed design that led the hotel market itself. Concrete, ceramic tiles, and unpolished local lava rock are used to establish the receptionist area with geometric decoration. Schumacher, a grandiose goal to make Bandung the Dutch East Indies capital, is shown in this hotel. But I don't look at the Schumacher from this point of view in the time. But I want to look at the three places of worship. Schumacher's distinctive contribution is his work on building for all three major religions, a Catholic cathedral, a Protestant church, and the Muslim mosque. This shows how deeply he involved the archipelago pluralism. The Bandung Cathedral is a famous example of epistemic imposition. It adopts a priestly neo-Gothic style to show that West has spiritual authority in the colonial landscape. But Schumacher changing in the Bethel Church. He adopted a more logical, stripped-down modernism that started to recognize building urban setting. Schumacher does something amazing called delinking in the Cipaganti Mosque. He admired the tajuk, jute roof shape of Javanese Islam, yet he talked about with the same accuracy as Art Deco. Wolf Schumacher was probably the most prolific Dutch architect in the Indies. His agency was found the artistic third-way between European modernism and the Indian tradition. Schumacher's trajectory revealed the limit of agency where engagement with the local form ultimate give way reintegration into global architecture modernism. Schumacher agency was his capacity to navigate different episteme. he could design for both colonizer and colonized, recognizing the complex multiplicity of global South. Schumacher work demonstrate the event in a colonial job. One can serve as catalyst for shared cultural memory. After looking at the work of these three architects, we can see they made incredible effort to go beyond adaptation or beyond just adapting the weather. We have seen how Henry McClellan tried to get rid of colonialism in structure by going deep tectonic investigation. We saw Thomas Carston who used urban planning to bring about a social change that was better for indigenous people, and Schumacher who skillfully moved between different episteme to emphasize the Aztec archipelago diversity. All three exemplify what they refer as architectural agency, the capacity of designer to maneuver within a concurrently opposed colonial framework. But a basic question comes up. Is there preference for this area actually a break or delinking from Eurocentric idea? Or maybe all these new ideas are merely a more substantial will to colonial power to stay important in the colony. Let's employ David Utama dan Samir Amin theoretical scalpel to dig further into this colonial memory. By viewing this building through Utama and Samir Amin theory, we unlock a colonial memory that is not just about operation, but about resilience of contextual knowledge. According David Utama, McClellan approach at Trawulan Museum and Church involves separating Javanese architecture from its cultural value. Pond apply engineering mechanic formula to perfect Javanese roof building into a system of cable and inverted arches. According to Samir Amin logic, what Pond did was not delinking. Although Pond employ local material and admire Javanese society, his basic reasoning was based on Western calculation. Henry McClellan did not let native architecture grow naturally based on its people-oriented relevance, but rather extracted from his own technocratic aim to construct a new Indian architecture. Carston did lay a higher weight on the social side, attempting to foster a synchronic encounter between European and indigenous culture. However, Carston, Carabel, and abstract approach eventually demonstrate Western elitism. He prescribed what Indian architecture should look like, as if he could speak for Javanese rather than allowing them to define it for themselves. Carston's work is a sample of what Samir Amin referred to as an illusory receptacular adjustment. Rather than allowing full sovereignty and autonomy to local power, Thomas Carston modified Javanese culture form to meet colonial administration require and need, such as transition from pendopo to folk theater. This directed modernization was largely an illusion that concealed the fact that the colonial bourgeois continue to accumulate and manage knowledge. Wolf Schumacher believed that the use adornment or objective beauty must based on scientific principle and European logic. He dismissed Matisse or local artisan knowledge as lacking literacy and scientific foundation. Schumacher work and theoretics are totally antithesis of the linking. Schumacher purposely become an agent devices capitalist expansion. His approach dismissed the fundamental worth of native Metis and considered Nusantara element as a dormant subordinate to techno of modern architecture. According Samir Amin, local architecture was driven to conform the Eurocentric norm and rationality, resulting in a lack of autonomy and relevance. The work of these three architects demonstrate through a scalpel of David Utama dan Samir Amin that they argue about new in this architecture was actually a debate among concurred to determine and the best way to extract it and subdue Nusantara architecture. Without the linking, a break from Western rationality and return a full control of local community-based autonomies, the goal and intention of McLampon via tectonic or Thomas Carson's social approach via spatial planning and Wolf Schumacher formalism via rationality eventually become trapped in an epistemic imposition that continue the position Javanese or Nusantara architecture as a subordinate object of Western modernity. This study contained the colonial architecture ought not to be perceived as a dichotomy of dominant and resistant, but rather as a domain of limited agency, where effort to serve connection inherently unfinished. Architecture is the most obvious record of our past. We might identify the foundation of our own architecture independence by going beyond adaptation. Thank you for your time. Let's talk. And I bring back to moderator. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew Hannes. I think it is very important to, or should I say, this is, the importance of your presentation, the importance of your discussion is that in the light of the fact that in Indonesian architectural schools, as you know, you and I both are faculty members of two different schools. The three architects, Pont, Carsten, and Schumacher, are always discussed, mentioned, studied, but as if they were didactic, so to speak, as if it is wrong if we don't study them, as if I'm trying to I'm not trying to belittle these three architects. Of course, they have the rights to be recognized as great architects within the colonial Indonesia at the time. They did have their impact that we have to recognize. Nevertheless, to see them critically is very important, and that has been missing in a lot of teachings of architectural schools in Indonesia. However, I would limit my discussion about it now because I think we should go to Bli Gede Mahaputra for his presentation. And after the two presentations, we will have, of course, Q&A session. Bli Gede, please, time is yours.
Thank you, Mas Jo, for presenting detailed information on how architects in the colonial era practicing on those indices. Here I'm gonna do a presentation in different perspective. I will call it framing paradise. The first premise is that architecture is never neutral. That is my first premise. Although if we go to bookshops, we see coffee table books on architecture of Bali, we will see beautiful tradition that look as if it was preserved very well by the Balinese, and that it's the value is carried from the traditional era to the contemporary situations. I will try to look at from, as I said, from a different perspective. Maybe this will be not so popular because I will try to challenge the view that Balinese architecture gained its or it is preserved until today. Uh, uh, in my propositions, I will see that Balinese architecture's identity is not a story of simple survival, as many believe. It is also not a story of pure colonial impositions, but it is a story of selections, reframing, and translations across politics, heritage, and tourism. This is the how we'll see the cases. The first, the story will start with the story of annexations of Bali from the northern part of the island, and then move to the south. And then I will see three different orientation on how architecture in Bali has been developed during the colonial era. The first orientation is the colonial government used traditional architecture as a means of diplomacy. And orientation two, the second is for paternalistic legitimations, while the third is commodification. It is the third, the commodification, that is carried by architects, by contemporary architects. So we see that many resorts, many hotels, they still are practicing the commodifications of traditions. And then the focus is not on the architecture, but on the more on the political sides of how architecture is used by colonial power to influence the world, to influence the locals, and to influence the businesses. And then the analysis will see what are the motive, who finance the preservations, and then we can see also the power relations between the architectural preservations and between the power relation between the government and the Balinese. And then where is the position of the Balinese in the preservation strategy? And then the research we will discuss later on that I will prove, or I will present that the paradise imagery of Bali, although we see a visual continuity, it is also contain a structural dependency. This is how the presentation will work. I am employing historical interpretive method. So the architecture will be used as evidence and as argument. So I will not discuss the style very much, but I will discuss the style, but from the point of view that to develop my argument that the paradise image is constructed by the colonial governments. So to dig deeper, I will see the political events around the time when the style was developed, and the material interventions, and also representational practices. Um, the material is archival, historical resources, and of course, because uh, it is quite common that people who visited Bali in the in early 20th century, starting from 1901 until 1940s, they always write the story. So we have ample evidence from travel writing and tourism narratives. And then I will try to read it closely from selected cases. Let us see from the annexations of Bali. So the Dutch come to Bali quite late, although they have been in Dutch East Indies since the 1557 or so, but they only arrived in Bali in 18 something. They started conquest the north. The important is not to get resources from Bali, but to occupy or to annex the port. Let me take the this part. This is the port. It linked the western part of Dutch. Oops, sorry. So the port is important because it links Singapore, Batavia here, maybe Semarang here, and then Surabaya, and then to Bali, and then go to Makassar, and also go to Lombok. So it is more of a link rather than try to get the natural resources or something that is valuable on the island of Bali. But they need the port, so they can create a park near Landika that they occupy the all parts of the Dutch is Indies. While the southern part of the island here, it is where the local power, where the kingdoms resided, where the political circumstances occur on the island of Bali. It is in the southern part of the island. So both the north and the south is important for the colonial powers, because if they only occupy the northern part, they maybe get constant threat from the south, from where the local powers resided. So they start to come to the south and occupy the southern part. And in 1908, 1908, they fully managed the island. So let us start from the colonial conquest and generic modernity in the northern part. Let me check the okay. It should come earlier. So it occupied the northern part in 1846 until 1849. It was a very long war, 3 years of war. When they come to the southern part in 1906, they conquest one of the strongest kingdom on the island, the Badung kingdom. It keeps moving. Sorry. This is the strongest one. And then in 1908, they also defeated the king of Klungkung, the most respected king on the island of Bali. So after the defeat of the Klungkung kingdom, so the whole island is under Dutch control. But they were criticized. I will tell the story later. Let me go through this first. In 1910, they started the initiation to construct the Bali museums. And then in 1917 and 1918, a big earthquake damaged the whole island. And then up to Pura Besakih, the biggest temple on the island of Bali. And in 1928, they started arguably the first hotel on the islands, which is the Bali Hotel. And then in 1931, they exhibit Dut East Indies, where the image of Bali dominantly stages for a global audiences. And in 1936, this is also arguably the first private hotel on the island of Bali is developed. So this is the chronology at a glance. Let us move to I already mentioned. Let us move to the story of how the island is occupied by the colonial power. So when they see the island as a place to reside the ships, ports and roads are more important than vernacular architecture or vernacular legitimacy. So Singaraja at that time, in the first or in the late 19th century, became colonial nodes in a larger colonial circuits that linking the western part of its Indies to Europe, and then to the east, linking to Makassar, to Ternate and Tidore, where the spices are found, and then up to the Philippines and up to China. So the Singaraja port is important to link the western and the eastern part of maybe of the globe. And Singaraja became a colonial node in that circuit. Architecture was first instrumental before it became representational. Let us see how the architecture become instrumental and not representational. So the issue at that time is not only new buildings because they develop buildings on the northern part of the island using similar style that can be found also in maybe in Java, in Sumatra, or maybe in Europe itself. So this is the the government building that they built in the northern part of the islands. So at this stage, local architecture is not yet become the central discussion to colonial legitimacy. We see that they adopted architectural style that also can be found in elsewhere in that is in Dice. Some of the buildings may I could not find the architect who designed this building, but as far as my explorations, as my reading of the text, almost all buildings were built by Chinese contractor. This is the Bali Hotel, so we can see the style. The element of traditions is not yet appear in the buildings that we see in the presentation. In contrast, it was the Balinese who were inspired by the Dutch. This one is New Wencom riding his bicycles that is immortalized in the temple. So it was at the time it was not the Dutch who got inspiration from the tradition from the Balinese, but the Balinese who got inspiration from the Dutch. We see that this one a temple relief showcasing a person with a pistol, with modern sword, with beard, and then even this one in the temple. So it looks with big nose, like the Dutch troop. So at first, it was the Balinese who were more influenced by the presence of the Dutch, and the Dutch they building like this, so they don't get any inspiration from the local. But the turning point was when they come to the southern part of the islands, or when they conquered the kingdom of Badung and the kingdom of Klungkung. So at first they created something like this. This is the original scene, but this is what they show us that they conquered the island, that they defeat the king. This is the body of the king, but while in reality the body of the king is here. So they would like to show that they are more powerful, more powerful than the local. But the war has been criticized in Europe because the locals in Perang Puputan, almost all king, the family, and also many of his people were died. The Dutch got a lot of criticism from the West because in that era, in general, in Dutch have been implemented what they call as ethical policy, where they should have the people to be more civilized. On the other hand, they do this, so they have been criticized. And during that war, Badung fell in 1906, Klungkung in 1908. The violence of the war compromised the moral image of Dutch rule on the island of Bali, and then that leads to the new needs that colonialism needed a different language, from force to culture of custodianship. This is the turning point of of colonial power on the island of Bali. Oops. So they start to use architecture as a representation. So presentation as a representation. It is how they would like to show the progress of Bali to the world. So they would like to silence the critics that are addressed to colonial power on the island of Bali. So they use a preservation strategy as a representation. Sorry, that the title is typo. I will discuss some cases here. The first case is the Bali Museum. After they defeat the kingdom of Badung, the whole palace of Badung was destroyed. This is the situation of the palace of Badung. But then when they built the museum, they asked the local undagi or the local architect to create a wall and the gate similar to what they have been destroyed. So this is a quite similar Candi Bentar or split gate of the palace. They rebuilt it as a museum. This is also a replica of the main gate of the palace, and then they rebuilt it in the close to it, but not on the former palace as a museum. It was initiated in the early 1910. So it's 2 years after the defeat of the king of Klungkung, and only 4 years after they destroyed the palace of Badung. So under colonial auspices. It was designed by a German architect, Kurt Grundler, and also later on, after Moen come to Bali quite often, especially after the earthquake, then Moen involved closely in the development or in the construction of this museum. So the local Undagi work on key architectural elements. And then the Balinese rulers who have been defeated contributed support, building materials, and also some money to the realization of this museum. So the result is museums that look like preserve culture by institutionalizing and framing it. So it is not simply preserve Bali; it start to arrange Bali. So it start to set a standard. The curator of the museum start to select what to be stored or what to what to exhibit in this museum. So the selections create like a standard, a new standard for art on the island of Bali. Oops. Because the museum is the museum targeted international audience, it start to reframe Bali. So it's also reframe the state and reframe architecture on the island of Bali. So local building forms, starting from that the establishment of the museum became political useful as authorized sign of Bali. So this is the political side of how the colonial governments try to silence the critics. So preservations become one of the instrument of colonial roles. Let us see. This is the initial sketches of the museums created by Kurt Grunder, but Moen modify a lot of the designs. The layout also changed, but the idea of reusing the traditional idioms like the Balikulkul, the gates is still there. The traditional gate is still there. So it shows that this museum is initiated by the colonial power. Uh, although European designs were used by Grunder and Moen, the physical form was involved Balinese Undagi. That's how the museum first started as the representations of colonial power on the island of Bali. The second case is the famous Colonial Expo in Paris. So while the museum shows, uh, I mean, while the museum located on the island of Bali, here the the colonial government staged its traditions to international audience in the center of colonial power in Europe, especially in Paris. Paris, Belgium, together with the Dutch, was a big colonial power at the time. Also, of course, with Spain and also with Germany. And in Paris, the expo occupied a very large site, and this is the Dutch is in this location. However, three main colonial power declined to participate. Great Britain was not participated, Germany was not participated, and also Spain was not participated. Well, maybe that there are conflict with France governments. But five European states, Denmark, Belgium, Italy, Netherlands, and Portugal bid pavilions, of course, with the host of France. This is when Dutch decided to participate in the exhibition. They had competitions. They invited several architects, several bureaux who are practicing in Dutch East Indies to participate in the design competition. Actually, they also invited original, or let's say Dutch East Indies born or inlander architect to participate. But Moen at the time decided not to include local born architect because he was worried if the inlander architects was not winning the competition, it will create a problem for them. So they decided that they will only invited Dutch architect. And this is the design. I took this from Bu Lukito's paper. Bu Lukito says that the pavilion was inspired by Balinese and by the Sumatran architecture and also by Javanese architecture. So it's a mix. It was Swedish who won the competition, but the overall image shows Bali very strongly because it has Meru, that is the most monumental structure, because uh, it the two Meru were the tallest on the pavilions, and they also use the Kori Agung, or the Great Gate, as the entrance, and also the overall wall was carved in Balinese style. So in 1931, Bali was staged in France. One of my colleagues said, not in a very serious manner, that's why Bali is more well known than Indonesia, because Bali has been staged in 1931 before Indonesia got independent. Maybe that's right, or maybe that's not proven right. So this is the pavilions. The pavilion was built in 1931, starting from 1929 to 1931. But Moen has been on the island of Bali since conducted research, a very detailed research on the architecture of the island after the earthquake in 1917. So he has a big data book on the islands, on the architecture of the island of Bali, and so he has gained also knowledge of Balinese architecture. So he is quite expert in commodifying local architecture. This big gate was a copy from a temple in Cembangaon in Gianyar, but Moen scaled it up to make it bigger. This is a copy of a temple in Besakih, Meru in Besakih, 11 tiered Meru, but also Moen also make it bigger. So this is the gate. It showcase Bali. Here is the three-dimensional image. This is the Dutch East Indies pavilion in here. It was compete with the Angkor. While the Angkor looks more like a copy of the original form, the Dutch East Indies pavilion, so on the opposite, is not a direct copy. of the local or traditional architecture in Indonesia. So the architecture get international audience in this event. Here, the image of the Dutch start to emerge as the pressure that as preserve the island here. A column by Gerard Hofil says Bali, the island of Bali, etc. So it start to get to be romanticized by the European audience here. It's charming theater in a place which in the evening seems slightly displaced and under dim lights a little mysterious. So the East was seen as the other by the Westerners, a place that is exotic, a place that is mystic, a place that is worth visiting. So it get start to gain attention from the Western audience. But in the Dutch is in Dice or in a colonial newspaper offered a different. They are criticizing the aesthetics of these pavilions. And architecturally, the pavilions drew heavily on Balinese temple imagery. It is also completed with a group of dancers, a group of theaters from Ubud who perform traditional dances of Bali almost every day. And even when the demand is high, they can dance twice a day in the morning and in the afternoon. And this exhibition was attended by millions of people in 8 months of its exhibitions. And then once selected and aestheticized, Balinese architecture could circulate as a sign beyond Bali. So it extends Bali to Europe. It extends the image that has been selected by Moen and Schwedig to Europe. This might not be the real Bali because it has been through a selection process, through a modification process, and although it looks like Balinese, it might not be the real Bali. But that what was read by the European audience, and on the island of Bali, they start to do a more critical selection. So this is a column saying that this is right and this is wrong. So they implemented the lessons that they got from Paris, that the European audience love the authenticity or the original traditions, while on the island of Bali, the local people start to modernizing their home, and the colonial power say it's wrong. So they say this is right and this is wrong. This is right and this is wrong. They start the selection process to start to frame Bali not to be modern. That's how they try to use preservation as a representation. Now, how they move preservation from representation as intervention and institutionalizations. In 1917, earthquake damaged the island of Bali. It's damaged sacred and courtly architecture across mostly southern part of the island. Moyen come to Bali in after the earthquake, and he went on to over the island with the task to document the damage of the earthquake. And then he create or he wrote a proposal to the colonial government and to the kingdom of Netherlands, to Queen Wilhelmina, that he proposed that we need to repair Bali. We need to repair the damage brought by earthquake. But because the money needed was very big, a large amount of money. the government decided that they will only restore or reconstruct Pura Besakih or Besakih Temple. The estimated cost at that time was 100,000 guilders. Moen convinced the royal government to donate a quarter of the cost, or 25,000 guilders, and Queen Wilhelmina even contributed 1,000 of her own money. The rest of the money come from local funding. So Besakih was very important for the locals. And then when the colonial government and even the Queen Wilhelmina gave money, they start to intervene the local belief. They start to intervene local people. This is an act to win the heart of the local. So they try to do this at best. Because Besakih is symbolically the biggest temple on the islands, and the whole kingdoms at the time responsible for Besakih, but they don't have money. And then at the time, the colonial government and Queen Wilhelmina came and gave initial money so they can start to reconstruct the temple. So the state at the time started to intervene not only in circulation and administration, but also in ritual continuity. So that's how they start to win the local. And then after that, they also start to establish a policy that all new buildings on the island of Bali should implement traditional idioms. Like these schools, there are 3 schools on the island of Bali which use traditional architectural idiom. This is part of the Bali sharing policy, which involve education, that the Balinese education system should develop its own curriculum, started from using traditional building style, changing the sport into dance, traditional dance. The drawing should be done in Balinese manner, etc. So the Bali sharing start from the school projects or from the education project, and these 3 schools shows us how they must start to reintroduce traditions to the youngsters. This is my alma mater, the Sekolah Rendah Pelihatan. I studied here for 6 years, and this is the building. Now it's gone. It is built by the Dutch government using the Bali sharing policy. So the second part, as I mentioned earlier, so they use preservation as intervention, and they start to institutionalize it through schools projects. Now the third is we will see how they use preservation as marketing strategies. Walter Spies is a German-born painter who stay in Ubud. He came to Bali after a short stay in Yogyakarta. In Bali, he started to stay in 1928. So he's very well known for for creating romantic image of the island. He who first criticized the modern building designs of the government building. He criticizes the Bali Hotel. He criticizes office building of the colonial. He says that if he would like to build on the island of Bali, we have to utilize the traditional knowledge. So he started to sketch his own pavilion on the island of on Ubud in Champuan. If you have heard of the name of the place, this is the sketches of the house, and this is how the house is built. The name of the local Undagu who involved is, if I'm not mistaken, Irangkup, a local Balinese. He helped Walter Spies to idealize his visions of how architecture should be built on the island of Bali. This is the house. It is still there now, used as a part of the larger hotel Champuan. So Walter Spies' house is not just a house. It is not something to be seen. So Walter Spies says that traditional architecture is not just something that we can enjoy, but something that we as a Westerner also can live in it. So the people who come from Europe actually come to Bali not only to see or not only to take photograph of the building, but also to live in the traditional architecture. So the importance of Space House in the development of the image of Bali is it is not literal reproductions. It is not generic colonial form. It create prototype effect. So Bali sharing becomes domestic and experiential, something that the Westerners also could experience it. And then come to surfers, the American Bob, Robert, and Louis Koch to Kuta. At first, they stay in a modern building in Bali Hotel, which is built in colonial style by architect AIA, FCL Giselle. But then they thought that they can build something better than Bali Hotel, something that give experience to the to the Westerners, give a local experience to the Westerner. So it's quite similar with the visions of Walter Spies. So when you come to Bali, you have to experience Bali, not just to see it, not just to stay in a modern hotel and then you go around the island only to see, but you can experience Bali. So he started to develop his own hotel in Kuta, the first hotel in Kuta. Uh, Bob or Robert Cook was a surfer, so he loved surfing. He found a place where the wave is good enough for surfing, and then he decided with his partner Louis to develop a hotel. And then he came to Walter Spies' house and asked Walter Spies, "Who built your house?" And then he found Irangkop, and then he asked Irangkop to develop his hotel in Kuta. And then in 1936, the hotel was start to be very well known among the Westerners, and then the colonial government start to create a negative image of his hotel. The colonial government say it's not healthy, it's hot. We are European. We are not. We are forbidden to stay in a hotel to live like local people. But Koch proved that his ideas, he and his partner's idea was a good thing because the rooms was always full. The room is never empty, and he always busy greeting guests, serving their food, and every night traditional dances were also performed uh, in his hotels. Until in 1938, political circumstances in Europe worsening and started the Second World War, and his hotel was damaged during the Second World War. So the Coke did not repeat the colonial hotel building. They commercialized a more intimate relation between guest and place. So he enlarged Walter Spies' visions that the Westerners can experience the island in a more intimacy scale. He started the new hospitality logic, a smaller scale, landscape intimacy, village adjacency, and also prototype. So the tourism at that time in 1930s, so it is after the Paris Colonial Expo where Bali started to get her fame to the global audiences. They not only shelter, but they also get experience of dwelling within an authorized image of Bali. So this is I will not go through it one by one, but this is the my main argument that the preservation of the architecture on the island of Bali is directed toward image making, to legitimacy, and to external economic interest. So if we see that the preservation is something that is romantic, my preposition try to offer a different point of view. So if we see from cultural diplomacy and image repair after the colonial government has been widely criticized in Europe, they do certain things, and then when they try to win the heart of the local people, they they go through certain activities, and then when they try to get economic benefit from the global audiences, they also went through certain actions. So what I would like to offer is to provide alternative perspectives rather than seeing Bali as something that is romantic, uh, uh, rather than see that the local people or the businesses preserve the traditions. I would like to prove that we can see it more in a more critical manner. By seeing it from a more critical manners, we will see the endurance of Balinese architectural language is real, but its history is inseparable from conquest, authorizations, and also commodification. I think that's the end of my presentation. Priming paradise means asking not only what survives, but who frames survival as architecture. Thank you.